Okay, you guys, Esther 9. We're going to hop straight into this. All the links and resources are down in the description box, including a link to all of the notes that I'll be writing in the Bible. So if you can't read my handwriting, that'll all be linked digitally down below. Let's hop in. Chapter 9, verse 1. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all other nations were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. So the day is here, the decrees are in place, and instead of the Jews being annihilated, they are able to defend themselves and prevail over their enemies. Not only are the Jews allowed to defend themselves, but they do a really great job of it. People are afraid of their power and their perseverance, and likely of their God who has put them in this opportunity. All the people of power in these towns and cities actually end up helping the Jews because they know Mordecai, they know he has a lot of power, and likely they saw what happened to Haman and they don't want to be the victim of something like that. Mordecai basically becomes famous for what he's done and how much power he holds, and this is kind of ironic because it's the same kind of fame that Haman had always wanted and never earned. So again, we see this role reversal that happens throughout the last half of this book, where Mordecai has now all of the stuff that Haman wanted so badly and went about so incorrectly. So let's make some notes and then we'll keep reading. Okay, so then we pick up in verse 5. The Jews struck down all of their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, here we go, time to butcher some names, 𝗓𝗮𝗯, Daphon, you know what, you guys, I'm not going to try it. There are 8 names here. And then the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Okay. Sorry for my pronunciation, you guys. But first I want to point to verse 5, that the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword. I want you guys to read a related passage, Romans 8:31. And honestly, if you can just read a big chunk of that book, it's wonderful. But the quote specifically that I want to talk about is, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" Because this really shows where God has just been instrumental in this entire plan, and he gives them the power and the authority to actually defeat their enemies. 500 men alone are killed in the citadel, and there are a ton of other provinces, and this is a massive amount of land that King Xerxes oversees. So enemies of the Jewish people are destroyed all over this country. There is also this partial list of some of the enemies conquered on this day, which are names that I cannot pronounce. And some of these men are descendants of Emilich. So we'll relate another verse, which is 1 Samuel 15, 2-3, where we see the descendants of Emilich being destroyed. And basically Saul is meant to destroy all of the Emilich nationality, anyone who is from the Emilich family. And Haman was a descendant of Emilich. But the point here is that now, even though Saul did not destroy all of his people, this is being finished off. And again, this just shows God's hand in this story, that a people that he wanted destroyed are kind of finished out in the book of Esther, which is just really beautiful. So let's go ahead and make some notes and we will talk about this. Okay, so I want to note really quick that Haman's son also attacked the Jewish people. And it's important to note here that the books very specifically states that the Jews did not take any of the plunder. They had legal rights to it, but this just shows that the Jews were not in this for self-preservation or to become rich or to gain something, but that it was purely self-defense. And you'll see that repeated throughout this book, that no one took any plunder. That's just pointing back to the fact that this was self-defense. It was not the Jews doing like an act of war or trying to have personal gain from this incident. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your position? It will be given to you." Petition. Sorry, guys. "What is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out the day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. And the Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Okay, so again, I'm going to underline that they did not lay their hands on the plunder because that's another important aspect. They were doing this in self-defense. But basically, in the citadel, another 300 men are killed. So that's 800 men total in just the citadel alone, which is like a small city, really compact into a small area. A large city compact into a small area. And 800 enemies of the Jewish people are killed. So we see that the reports are being brought to the king. And his response is interesting. He doesn't really seem that concerned that 800 people have died, and he even makes a note how many more have been killed in the king's provinces. You have to remember, when we went back in the start of the book, when Haman originally sent out this decree, he framed all of this so that the king thought that by killing the Jews, he was kind of crushing a group of people that would otherwise rise up and maybe go against the king or something like that. And so I have a feeling here that that's the same kind of thing. The king now knows that the Jewish people are his allies. One of them is his literal wife. And so anyone who is an enemy of the Jews, he probably sees as an enemy of his own power and authority. And so he doesn't really care how many people have died. He even offers to help Esther wrap things up. He doesn't seem bothered at all by the war happening. So Esther asks to extend the fight one more day to kind of wrap up the battle and defeat the enemies of the Jews fully. She also asks for Haman's 10 sons to be hung on the gallows, or as we've talked about, impaled on poles. What translation you're reading will differ. But Haman's sons were also descendants of Emilich, so they're Amalekites. I definitely said that wrong. These are men that Haman was so proud of, and they end up meeting his same fate. So God completes his judgment against the Amalek people, and he also uses Mordecai and Esther to show his power and authority and show that the Jewish people are truly his people. So let's go ahead and make some more notes here. Okay, so now we pick up in verse 16. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and to get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th. Then on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as the day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. So, 75,000 enemies of the Jews were killed in the provinces, and again, in pure self-defense, they don't take any of the plunder. And unlike the citadel, the provinces actually rest on the 14th day. In the citadel, they have an extra day of fighting because the king sent out an additional edict to allow it to continue for one more day. So then in the citadel, they take the 15th day as a rest day. Either way, the holiday kicks off with food and celebration, just like most holidays. And the Jews not only celebrate the lives that were restored to them, but also being able to defeat so many of their enemies. The Jewish people are persecuted throughout the entire Bible, and even now into modern day Israel. And so when we see this, we see that finally the Jews have had a victory and they are feeling free for probably the first time since that first decree went out. So let's make some more notes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read through the last of this. It's a lot, but then we'll break it down. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes near and far. to have them celebrate annually on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as a time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving of presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of 𝗵𝗵 the Agagite, and the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the 𝗼, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme of Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on its own head, and that he and his son should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim from the word 𝗼. Purim. Sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish a custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year, in a way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province and every city. And to these days of Purim should never fail to celebrate by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So, Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim as their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as it had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. Okay, so essentially what this is kind of an overview of what happened, and it turns this into an actual Jewish celebration. So the Feast of Purim, I think is how you say it, or Purim. I'm sorry, I only read it, I never heard it. But it's still celebrated by Orthodox Jews to this day. So basically we get a super short version of the Esther story as a whole, and a reason for the holiday to be passed through the generations. So I'm going to make some notes. There are also some related passages regarding the celebration and everything that I think would be helpful to read, but we'll wrap this up in just a moment. Okay, so that is almost the end of the book of Esther. We're going to go over Esther 10 and a couple of the key points from the whole book in the next video. But for now, that is it. If you guys have any questions, there's a blog post linked down below where you can leave them. Comments are turned off for these videos just because of the pure amount of spam I get on them. But please leave your questions or email them to me if you have them. Thank you for walking through this with me, and I'll see you in the last video.